Last month, 75 teenagers from Pennsylvania petitioned Her Majesty the Queen to have the Beatles knighted. Well, this hasn't happened. But today I'm pleased to say that they have been made members of the most honourable order of the British Empire. Congratulations, John, George,
Thank you.
Ringo, and Paul. Tell me, how did you all react to this?
Well, I went...
Which means in sound. Whoopee. Well done. George.
Well, I sort of went, wow, that's great.
Ringo.
Yes?
About the same.
Yes, I think we all felt pretty well the same.
What does this MBE mean to you all? How are you going to deck out to go to the palace? There's certain protocol to be observed. Are you going to dress up in morning dress?
Yes, I think you've got to, haven't you?
Yeah, we'll have to.
We'll get it.
What about the haircut, Ringo?
Well, we're not going to get it all cut off, you know. Someone said we can carry the hat, so that'll be easier.
I think Her Majesty will understand, you know.
She may well do. From obscurity in a cellar in Liverpool 4 years ago and now to Buckingham Palace.
Yeah.
Well done.
As you all know, Harris Wilsard won the general election with a very small margery over the Torchies, thus putting the labouring party back into Powell after a large abscess. This he could not have done without span the barking of the trade onions, headed by Frank Cunnings, who now has a safe seat in Nuneaton, thank you, and Frank, only 62, Bowles, who hasn't. Sir Alec, doubtless whom, was, quote, bitterly disappointed, but managed to keep smirking on his 500,000-acre estate in Scotland with a bit of fishing and that.
I thought, hello. I'm sorry, sometimes I feel less than useless at these sessions. I really do. Of course, Cynthia understands. I often talk to her about it when we get home. I say, sometime, you know, Cynthia, just go and get the note.
Yeah.
She understands a lot of things like that because she went to Bali for our holidays. You know, Bali, I always thought it had
Same bit again.
Yes, yeah.
I don't care how you feel, I feel ridiculous.
I always thought it was a Welsh grammar school, lad, you know, Ballyaye.
Come back, Neil. You know, little things like that, Paul, you can just throw me. Can we just do the little bit together and let me... Because I've forgotten what it was.
All right.
Just the last one. Come on, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2.
And you've got time to rectify all the things. And you've got time to rectify all the things that you should.
That was
That
it.
you should.
You should have got me there, boy. I was
And you've got
moving.
time to rectify.
Until I'd known to get back in here, you know. He's kind of grooving out of the place, you know.
He's here all the time.
Is he? I can bet there's just a drawing. Oh, I've got it now. Listen to this. I'm going to give expression as well.
Hello, welcome to episode 48 of Glass Onion on John Lennon. Closing in on the big 5-0. It's coming soon, couple of weeks. So today is the completion of my talk with Eoghan Lyng about John Lennon in 1965. Just before I talk about the clips that you just heard there, I got an email from a listener called Dave White, who's actually a Brit living in the US. He's a foreign language translator for US public radio. Listen to this, specializing in the link between US intelligence, multinational corporations and international fascism. That sounds a lot more fun than just sitting in an office typing away at a computer, doesn't it? Dave and I had a bit more correspondence. I got him to flesh that out a little bit. And he talked about Peter Dale Scott and the idea of the deep state, which is the government behind the government. Deep state, I think, is a good phrase to use because it avoids the word conspiracy, but still gives you the idea, which to my mind is absolutely clear that there is a state behind the state, so to speak. Dave also made a comment on his email related to the episodes with Mick Ord about 1972. He said, a bootleg taper friend of mine from New York heard about the sale of the 1-to-1 tickets, that's the August 72 concert at Madison Square Garden, on the radio and rushed down to the MSG Madison Square Garden box office to get the tickets in order to have the best seat. He was surprised to find only one other person in the queue in front of him. So suggesting there that the anticipation for the concert wasn't as huge as perhaps you would expect. Certainly the reaction, I guess we talked about this already, was muted and it was considered not a great concert, whereas if you watch the films, when they actually bring it out properly, bring out a good official version, I think you'll hear and see how good that concert was. Anyway, so the clips. First one was related to the news of the Beatles getting their MBEs. The announcement was made in June, and then they actually received them in October. And there were various interviews which were all quite amusing. So that was a clip of one of them. I think they did BBC and an ITV on the same day. What's interesting about this is that, as Owen and I were saying last week in part one, this was a transitional year. And what was actually happening in 65, they were smoking a lot of weed. And in that case, they were able to be giggly about it and sort of send it up. This thing about being in on a joke. And the joke was how ridiculous this MBE was. And perhaps the joke between the Beatles was something to do with the fact of them being used with these MBEs as some sort of political pawn, let's say. And that's actually is mentioned later in a clip of somebody protesting the Beatles getting their MBEs. And, you know, they took it fair enough. I think the weed thing allowed them to be the giggly Beatles, but not for the reason that people thought, if that makes any sense. It's a gentle sort of subversion. But it's interesting, in one of the clips you're going to hear, because there'll be another MBE clip later, they actually do talk about the sort of exports side of it, that they got it for that reason. So, I mean, it's nice to see that sort of candidness. The MBEs and OBEs and knighthoods and things, they really have reached ridiculous levels now where, you know, people can work tirelessly for charity, and if they're lucky, they get an MBE. There was a lady who worked at my primary school back in the 80s, and she actually stayed at the school till something like 10 years ago, and she got an MBE, and she'd done all this kind of work, whereas, you know, you ride around in a circle on a bicycle. Nothing against that guy. I think his name is Chris Hoy. But, you know, he gets knighted, or, you know, if you're a golfer, you know, you whack a little white ball into a hole very well. And yes, it's entertaining, and yes, it brings happiness to people. But, you know, let's not pretend that there isn't a commercial aspect to it, you know. Anyway, so that was the first clip. The second one was John, of course, reciting the general erection, which is related to the one in 64, which actually brought Harold Wilson into power. That was a very close election. You actually hear a bit of me reciting that later on, so I thought I'd better put a clip in at the beginning of the man himself doing it much better than I can. And that's obviously related to John's second book, Spaniard in the Works, coming out in 65. And then finally, there was a clip from the Think For Yourself session during the making of Rubber Soul, obviously. And that was something we didn't mention, was a Christmas record. That was obviously another part of the Beatles' year, as it was traditionally. And what actually happened was that because they were in a bit of a rush with Rubber Soul, they decided that they would let the tapes roll, and they would basically record a rehearsal, of which I think there's 19 minutes of it, just in case they said something funny that they could use for the Christmas records. So you kind of get the Beatles in one way being very natural, but then they're very, very clearly clowning for the reason that they know it's being recorded. And to be perfectly honest, of the 19 minutes, most of it isn't actually that funny at all. There's a bit where John goes off to the toilet and he clearly goes to have a sneaky joint, and you hear them saying, "John, come back," you know. Weed is just all over 1965. You just can't get away from it. As usual, I'm going to tease you with a few of the events, although I think I summarised them at the end of the last episode. But anyway, so obviously the Beatles, they do Shea Stadium in 65. They meet Mr. Presley. There's the MBE thing. There's a music special at the end of the year celebrating Lennon and McCartney songwriting. And of course there's a film, and there's 2 albums, the second of which is definitely one of my big favourites. Anyway, you will hear all about that. So I'm going to let you get on with listening, and I'll be back on the other side with a few words. Enjoy.
So Lennon said that he felt that Help and Strawberry Fields Forever were the acme or the apex of his Beatles writing, that they were real songs, they weren't songs to order. I might be with him there. I think they show a great sense of self. Out of all the Beatles songs, they're the ones that pinpoint to the confessional rock record that is Plastic Ono Band.
Oh, yeah. I think even when he was at his most cynical, he acknowledged probably I'm a Loser, Help in My Life, and Strawberry Fields, I suppose.
Yeah. Although, in fairness to Lennon, in 1980, when he was asked what are the 2 Beatles songs that will stand the test of time, he chose Paul's Eleanor Rigby and Hey Jude.
Oh, interesting. I think sometimes maybe giving someone else credit is a way of, I don't know, settling your own ego. I'm not sure. Just an idea.
It has a wonderful triptych of harmonies where John singing the lead and Paul and George are hanging in with a chorus of harmonies. They're doing their thing and John singing his thing. That happens on a lot of John songs, but I don't think that really happened on Paul's songs. Maybe on The Night Before, where John and George, the night before.
It almost suits the dynamic, doesn't it? Because John was, I mean, this is another argument for another day, but Paul kind of took over. I think John, up to a certain point, was still their kind of hero, you know, their kingpin hero, and having the two of them there sort of supporting him seemed to be symbolically accurate. To carry on with these dates, what have we got? May and June. Do you want to just pick a couple there?
So the announcement of the MBEs on June 11th, that's a pretty big one.
Yeah, and those interviews, again, they're clearly high and they're just sending it all up and they're having a great time, you know.
Yeah. The Queen asked Ringo, did he found the band? No, I was actually the last one to join.
Yeah, I'm the little fellow, he said. Yeah. They're saying, from obscurity in a cellar 4 years ago to this, and John does the action of pretending he's about to shed a tear, you know, wiping a tear from his eye. And it's brilliant. I mean, they're just so clearly sending the whole thing up.
Now, last year in America, your record sold no less than $10 million worth. Do you think your export sales has something to do with this?
Well, you know, somebody said it might have been that.
The papers keep telling us it was
it could have been that, but it could have been...
It might have been for tour in Australia.
Now, do you think you'll go back to the Commonwealth again? This was a sensational visit.
Yeah.
Well, you know, we probably will. It's up to Mr. Epstein, our manager.
They were sent from the Prime Minister at Downing Street to our manager's office, and they were delivered from there to Twickenham, where we were filming. And then about the day later, we just found them, and we thought we were being called up for the army. And then we opened them, and we found out we weren't. We weren't.
all said that line.
I know, but this is at ITV. That was the other one.
I see.
Now, two of you have got married, and you all live in, well, good domestic splendour. Has this affected your writing, Paul and John?
No, it's easier to write with cushions and so, on pieces of hard bench, which you know we were on hard benches before we met.
Yeah, in the slime and
unknown cellar of Liverpool, and it's much easier on a nice cushion.
Anyway, it hasn't changed your life to any great extent.
No, we're just honoured, that's all.
We're all delighted.
Thank you.
Congratulations.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for coming.
It's a great way of, it's their attempt at subversion, you know?
Yeah, of course.
I mean, later in the decade, he'd come out with stuff and he'd send his MBE back. For then, I think smoking weed as well was great for them because it made them a bit giggly. It was something they could all share.
Yes.
And, you know, this idea that the Beatles were always in on some joke that they never told anyone else about, you know, it just heightened it even more. So I enjoy this period.
Of course, by the 90s, you know, Paul earnestly accepted a knighthood, and then Ringo would 20 years later. So I guess you have to mature with age.
Yeah, and Mick Jagger as well in the middle of that as well.
Yeah.
And then I've just got here a recording of Like a Rolling Stone, because again, it's a seminal. That was June the 15th and 16th, and Satisfaction a month earlier. Now, there's a couple of things here about his writing. So on the 16th, he was interviewed for BBC Radio's The World of Books by Wilfred Diath. Of course, if you take away the apostrophe, you've got Wilfred Death. Story. And then 2 days later, he was on the Tonight TV show. Now, this is very significant because actually a year earlier, the host, Kenneth Alsop, had him on the show in his own right. And he'd said to John Lennon, why don't you put the same kind of spirit into your lyrics? Because at that time, you know, before obviously the Dylan influence as well, his lyrics were totally apart from his other writing, you know?
Yeah.
There was pop lyrics and then there was this. There was my artistic side and then there was pop lyrics, you know? If you don't mind, I would like to recite one piece from Spaniard in the Works.
Go ahead.
I haven't memorized it. I've got it here. This is a short version. So this is all about the general erection. I don't know how to pronounce that first bit. As we all know, harassed Wilsod won the general erection with a very small margery over the torches, thus putting the labouring partly back into Powell after a large abscess. This he could not have done without span the barking of the trade onions, heady by Frank Cunnings, who now has a safe seat in Nuneaton, thank you, and Frank, only 62, Bowles, who hasn't. Sir Alice Doubtless Whom, that was Alec Douglas Hume, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Was, quote, bitterly disappointed, but managed to keep smirking on his 500,000-acre estate in Scotland with a bit of fishing and that.
And that was the second lesson, according to John Lennon. Once again, he's put on his writer's hat to follow up the success of his first book in his own right with another epic of inconsequence, A Spaniard in the Works, a little work full of pieces of political wisdom such as we've just heard, and moving poems like The Wumber Log or The Magic Dog.
Whilst all the tower was sleepy, crept a little boy from bed, to feign the wondrous people what lived when they were dead. He packed a little voucher for his dinner neath a tree. Perhumps a tiny dwarf or two would share a bite with me. Perchamp I'll see the Wumbalog, the highly feathered crow, the laughing, leaping Harris Tweed, and good old Uncle Joe. He packed the very trunk case, clean sockers for a week, his book and Denzil for his notes, then out the windy creep. He met him friendly magic dog, all black and curlew too, what flew him fast in second class to do what he must do.
Mr. Lennon, your first book was a bestseller, and I shouldn't think there's any doubt this one's going to be too. Do you think that you'd be published were you not a Beatle?
I could probably get published, but, I wouldn't sell as many. I mean, they publish a lot of rubbish anyway, but I wouldn't sell.
Do you think you've got a built-in advantage in being a Beatle? I mean, are you glad about this, or would you rather have earned a reputation as a writer in your own right?
No, I never thought of it. If I hadn't been a Beatle, I just wouldn't have thought of having the stuff published, because I would have been crawling around broke and just writing it and throwing it away. Might have been a beat poet.
How did it come about that you weren't a beat poet and that your first book was published?
Well, some American who shall remain nameless was called Michael Brown. I showed him the stuff and he took it to the publisher and they published it. That was it.
Did you ever think of publishing it under a pseudonym, not as John Lennon?
I thought of that, but what's the use there? Because he took it to the publisher first without telling them who it was, just to see if they would have published it. So that answers your first question as well.
It does indeed, yeah. Living in, the butterfly world of pop as a Beatle, do you find that this undermines people's serious acceptance of you as a writer?
It does, but I didn't really expect them to take me seriously, so, there's nothing to say about that. They do take it more seriously than I thought, so that's good enough for me.
Indeed, I mean, the first book was reviewed in the Posh Sundays, and on the other side of the fence, your music's recorded by people like Ella Fitzgerald. Now, this is serious recognition in both areas. Which do you find more satisfying?
Well, the book, really, because it means more to other people that Ella Fitzgerald recorded one of our tunes than it does to us, because the tune is still something that Paul and I have written, so we still have the same faith in it. It just gives other people more faith in the tune.
This book's very similar to the first in being bits and pieces of poems and bits of prose. Do you think you'd ever want to write anything longer, a novel, for example?
Well, I tried, right. The longest thing I've written is in this book. It's one about Sherlock Holmes, and it seemed like a novel to me, but it turned out to be 6 pages. I couldn't do it now. I get fed up, and I didn't know who was... I brought so many characters in, I forgot who they were,
This happens to other writers, too.
Oh, other writers, good.
The pop business is a young man's world. It seems to have an ever-increasingly young audience. Do you think that perhaps writing a book like this, and writing at all, perhaps might be an unconscious attempt to win recognition in the adult world?
No, because I started all this writing long before I was a pop artist, or even a Beatle, or before I had a guitar. So it's nothing to do with that. The guitars came second.
And which comes first?
Well, now the guitars come first, because this is still a hobby, which it always has been.
Are you going on doing it, are you?
I'll go on doing it.
I mean, have you written anything else? Is there anything else coming after this? A third one in the series?
Well, I don't get much time. If I had more time, I'd probably write more. The publisher rang up and said, have you written anything yet? I said, no, I've been writing songs, because I can't do both at once. I've got to concentrate on the book or the songs. So I haven't written anything since this.
We'll look for it, nevertheless, John. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
The Torchies, now in apparition, have still the capable qualities of such disabled men as Rabbit Bunloaf and the very late Harrods Macmillan. Yeah. Brilliant reference to Harrods there. What, you ask, happened to Answerm Enos, ex-Prim Minicar? I think that's Anthony Eden, ex-Prime Minister. After that Suez pudding, people are saying, well, I don't know, etc., etc. Yeah, there's some great stuff. My favourite one is Princess Margaret being described as priceless margarine. That's a good one.
In 1968, the Small Faces recorded an album called Ogden's Nutgun Flake, and they hired an actor called Stanley Unwin, who invented Unwinese.
Stanley Unwin, yeah.
One of the summit and half of this is what Emerson said, that Ulysses knows no remedy save that which or wax or stuffy into the eardroves in order to pass the siren safely. And I think he was twice times 19 for 30 acres when he said that.
You've probably seen these interviews where John's trying to play down these influences. Not Unwin so much, but Tennyson and Swift. And, because I think genuinely, and he seems a bit self-conscious about putting himself out there as a writer. Yeah. Perhaps he doesn't think it's going to be taken seriously, or he doesn't take it seriously.
You see interviews of Samuel Beckett when people bring up his influences. He gets very shirty and needlessly defensive because, for whatever reason, maybe it's the artistic and passion
I deny it because I'm ignorant. I was ignorant of Lear. I'd heard the name, obviously, somewhere, but we didn't do him at school, and the only sort of classic kind of all very highbrow or anything kind of things I'd read were at school, or that I knew of, and Joyce and Chaucer. I might have read a bit of Chaucer at school, because I think they do that. So I bought all the books that they said it was like. I bought one book on Edward Lear, I bought Finnegan's Wake, a big book on Chaucer, and I couldn't see any resemblance to any of them. A little bit of Finnegan's Wake, but Finnegan's Wake was so way out and so different. Just a few word changes, but anybody who changes words is going to be compared. Oh, Lewis Carroll, I always admit to that, because I love Alice in Wonderland and Alice Through the Looking Glass, but I didn't even know he'd written anything else. I was that ignorant. I just happened to get those for birthday presents as a child and liked them, and I usually read those too about once a year because I still like them.
I agree with Lennon that maybe A Spaniard in the Works was a little rushed, and he also said that he was drinking too much and he realised if he kept going on this way he'd become an alcoholic. I think In His Own Right is the masterpiece of those two works. I mean, it's bold, it's brave, it's new, it's the difficult second album or the difficult second book.
Yeah, as you said, a lot of bands, when they're coming up, they've honed these songs for a few years. And John Lennon, In His Own Right, of course, goes back to school, the Daily Howl, and we know all about that. And Spaniard in the Works was somewhat to order. I don't think he had a lot of material left. And I think there's one story of him literally going off into a room with a bottle of whiskey and just saying, all right, fuck it, I'll come up with something.
Yes.
Alrighty. And then they had like a European tour. And July the 2nd and 3rd, Beatles play at Bull Rings in Madrid, Las Ventas. We both know about that, don't we?
Yeah.
And Barcelona. At this point, why don't we talk about John Lennon's songs from the first half of the year?
Okay.
So since there's not too many of these, I'm actually going to read the list for the listeners. So this is like the first half of 65. So Ticket to Ride, Yes It Is, Help, You Got to Hide Your Love Away, You're Going to Lose That Girl, It's Only Love, and Tell Me What You See. Tell Me What You See may have been more Paul. I'm not sure about that one. That may be 50-50.
Well, Paul sings it, doesn't he?
Well, I think he sings the first line of the verses and then John joins him. So, I mean, how many? I'd say 3 bona fide classics there. Ticket to Ride, Help, and You Got to Hide Your Love Away.
I put 4. You're going to Lose That Girl.
Yeah, as well. Yeah, it's very well regarded, isn't it?
Yeah.
Again, very clever songwriting in a way, because the verse and the chorus have got the same chords except one chord. So he does like a 4-chord trick but changes one of the chords. It's sort of lazy and clever at the same time, but if you get away with it, then it's not lazy,
No. Going to your point that I'm more of a McCartney guy, I think Lennon is showing the greater works in 65. But barring Yesterday, I mean, which is the most covered song of all time, which I think you could make a point for that. I think Lennon's on a great artistic peak in 65, and Paul, who's a bit younger, has to hit that peak in 66.
Yeah, I'd go along with that. I mean, in 64 as well, Paul went very quiet. I mean, John had most of the Hard Day's Night album, and then it's...
Yeah.
I bought a book ages ago, this is years and years ago, that went through all their songs, and it had like a chart at the end that told you like percentages of who wrote what. And it's just, of course, that's been revised because that was many years from now, I mean, probably never get to the bottom of that totally, but...
Probably not, no.
I've got a lot of time for Yes It Is, apparently about his mother, and that's a B-side. That was one of the ones with the tone pedal thing that George was using. That was an innovation. It's Only Love, I'd put lesser. I think when I did my episode with Jason, I put that on my list, actually, of his worst songs. Quite unquite worst.
I would say it's probably his worst. I think it's inessential, it's risible, it's got all the worst.
Still, yeah, but then still listenable, When we did this list of worst songs, we pointed out that we didn't think he'd actually written... I don't think he wrote hardly any bad ones. I think there's one on Rubber Soul that gets attacked quite a bit, but we'll get there in a minute.
Yeah. Indeed.
Yeah, non-Lennon, I mean, Dylan went electric. That was, again, a big deal. The Newport Folk Festival. Great performance on Maggie's Farm. Brilliant stuff. July 29th, we got the release of Help film with its accompanying premiere. What do you think about that film, looking back?
I do love the whizzy energy that it has, and it's almost Pythonesque with, these inserts of battiness. Like there's one bit where they say, we'll have a quick interlude, and they open up on a lady being washed and a Northern English lady saying to, what are you doing in that temple for?
You come back at all hours in all colours. I've talked about that before, yeah. I love that bit.
End of part 1. Intermission. End of intermission. Part 2.
Where you been, eh? You've been up that temple again, haven't you? And as bad as your sister coming home from work all hours and all colours.
End of part 2.
There's a motif of a diver, and the Beatles keep pointing him in the direction of Greenland.
Yeah, it's Mal Evans, yeah.
Is it?
Mal Evans. Yeah, yeah.
Oh, okay, I didn't know.
Yeah. I mean, I just love surrealism. We reviewed How I Won the War a couple of months ago. And it's flawed, but there's some great ideas. Again, pre-Python.
I do think it's much more... Richard Lester had much more of a control of this film than he had on A Hard Day's Night. I feel like he's the main character and he's using the Beatles as pawns. Maybe that's an unfair thing to say, but I feel like he's not telling their story. He's using them to tell his story.
Yeah, they weren't the easiest to work with in the most charming way. You know the story when they're doing the curling?
Yeah.
And Ringo and Paul had to run off or something, and they ran down a mountain so they could have a joint together before they came back.
And they ran for miles, yeah.
Yeah, that's it, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, God. Sounds like it was fun, but it really works as a caper. I think Hard Day's Night you could take seriously as a kind of an arty film, but Help, I think the surrealism possibly saves it, actually.
I would.
Because I've forgotten about that Mal Evans bit. That's brilliant.
Yeah. Richard Lester, the director, had worked with Peter Sellers quite a bit in the 50s and 60s, so that influence, yeah.
Well, when we did How I Won the War, we talked about this kind of through line that goes somewhere from the Goons to the running, jumping, standing still film, which was...
Oh, that's marvellous.
Lester, yeah, with Sellers. Yeah. And then you got the Beatles, then you got the Bonzo Dog Doodah Band, and then you've got Python, and there is a kind of progression there.
Well, of course, Spike Milligan, who was one of the Goons, when he was asked about Python, he said, "It's nice to see my nephews are doing so well." Which I think is fair enough.
That's a good one, yeah. Well, they call Richard Lester the godfather of MTV or something, don't they?
Yeah.
Because you can extract now, although they weren't considered to be videos, you can extract them from Help, and you've got to hide your love away, another girl. You've got a pop video, you know?
Yes. Film Help, it subverts all these stereotypes, like Paul is seemingly the cute one. Eleanor Bron just looks at him and she's in fits of giggles, like, ooh.
Yeah.
Maybe Paul had that magnetism in 1965, I don't know.
She had an affair with John, I think, didn't she? I think that's fairly well established now, yeah.
Probably. I mean, there's also rumours of him and Maureen Cleave.
Yeah, Maureen Cleave, yeah. Sonny Freeman was definite because they lived in the same house or the same apartment block, didn't they? Robert Freeman and his wife.
It's strongly rumoured that Paul and Yoko had a fling before. We're probably heading into very, very murky territory here.
We are, yeah. Is Help supposed to be some sort of James Bond spoof? Because you hear the music, but I never really took it as that.
I would say that there's splashes of Bond put in. A lot of the reviews painted it as a Bond spoof, but it also was spy mania at this point, where there were a lot of cheap spy movies made at this point.
And there's some allusions that it was influencing Batman or something like that.
Oh, that's what Lennon said, yeah.
Is that what he said? Yeah. Well, it's got that kind of 65, not quite psychedelic, but quite wacky. It's wacky without the hard drugs, if you know what I mean. It's a soft drug film rather than Head or maybe Magical Mystery Tour, which are more LSD-influenced films, perhaps.
Yes. I think Mike Hodges is a fan of the Help film, and he directed 1980's Flash Gordon, which, of course, is this whizzy, flashy film that made it sort of this opulent opera of camp.
Yeah.
I think it's marvellous. A lot of people don't like it.
Well, I mean, these things go out in and out of fashion, don't they?
Yeah.
You know. You want to pick up some other ones? August, maybe?
Okay, yeah. So then there's the Blackpool Night Out you've written here. And that was on the 1st of August. And then on the 6th of August, the Help album, which I actually regard quite highly. People see it as sort of a filler album, but I think, though, there's a lot of artistic merit to it. I regard it higher than A Hard Day's Night.
Oh, really? Right.
I think
it's a strange one, because we're talking about bona fide classics. We can obviously add Yesterday to the ones we were just talking about, or that you mentioned already.
The two cover songs are probably the two best cover songs of their career. I mean,
which ones are they? Naturally,
and Dizzy Miss Lizzy. I mean, that's what a way to say we're not doing covers anymore. You come in with this thunderous heavy metal track.
There's probably a few filler ones. You Like Me Too Much, I was never a huge fan of. Tell Me What You See is all right. I mean, but even their worst is still fairly good. You know?
Another Girl isn't a great track, but it has a wonderful guitar solo that Paul played.
That was a good video as well from Help.
Indeed.
And then they flew out for their North American tour. Now, I didn't realise how short this was, so I've got 10 concerts and 2 to 3 weeks. Something like 17 days or something like that.
I made this point last year, but Bill Harry said that Pete Best played more live hours with the Beatles than Ringo ever did.
Yeah. Well, they were down to about 25 minutes at this point, weren't they?
Yeah.
Wonder what the shortest concert they did was. I'd have to try and find that out. Chuck Gunderson's done some good books. He's done the definitive books of the North American tour, so I'll get there one day.
That's good.
So they flew out on August the 13th, and then we got, obviously, Shea Stadium. Now, the Shea Stadium recording that we hear is not what they would have heard on the night, if anyone actually heard it. It's still not clear. Could the Beatles hear themselves, and could anyone hear them from the audience? What do you think?
I know a lot of live albums, like Peter Frampton and Thin Lizzy. Most of that was re-recorded in studios. So,
I mean, there's no doubt that it was re-recorded, but I mean, you do hear the audience start sort of shouting when they hear the names of the songs, so it tells me that they probably heard something.
Well, no, something wasn't released until 1969.
Very good. Yes, very good. God, I walked into that one, didn't I? Of course, hilariously, they were using the PA that they used to announce the players. Is it a football or baseball stadium? Oh, shit.
I don't know.
Sorry, American listeners, you're all shouting the answer at me. I think it's baseball.
It probably is baseball.
Yeah, and then I think 56,000 is a generally accepted number for the crowd, but on the anthology, they all talk about how it's a different number. Paul played there again just before it was closed down.
Okay.
Just recently, yeah. I mean, it's a brilliant film, Beatles at Shea Stadium. Weirdly enough, they used the studio version of Act Naturally, so they didn't even bother trying to pretend that we were hearing what they heard on the night. But anyway, it was a happening rather than a music event.
Well, I mean, you watch clips of like Freddie Mercury and Queen in the 80s, and Freddie's, throwing himself away from the microphone when a vocal's going on, and, he's silhouetting while he's supposed to be singing Radio Gaga. So I don't think it was that uncommon.
Yeah. I think there is some raw audio of Shea Stadium. I haven't heard it myself, but it's out there somewhere. And then during this trip, I mean, there are a couple of really big events, 2 or 3 actually. August 24th, they do this John and George's second LSD trip, and the first one they planned. Ringo took it as well. Neil Aspinall took it, and Neil Aspinall had to deal with a journalist called Don Short, who was at this party. Basically, they'd hired a house. They invited a bunch of people, including Hollywood people. But poor old Neil Aspinall was on his first LSD trip, but had to play the part of, Neil Aspinall and deal with this journalist who wanted to talk to the Beatles. And, of course, the Beatles are like, the last thing they need is a journalist poking around.
I know that Philip Norman, in his McCartney books, met with the wrath of Aspinall. Apparently, McCartney said, you come with us. And he was going in, and Aspinall basically told him to fuck off, which was my reaction to Philip Norman when I read the Shite book.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, he's had a bit of a checkered past, that guy.
Yeah.
So, they had this LSD trip. I mean, it was a big thing for John and George. I found out recently, actually, talking about revisionism, it seems fairly clear now that Paul actually did his first LSD trip in December 65 rather than autumn 66, which was the popular idea. And that changes things a little bit, because that means that he'd done it by the time he took Revolver. See what I did there? He'd done it by the time they recorded Revolver.
Yeah. I think the Beatles, John and George, made it seem like, Paul had only done it twice before he went on TV and talked about the wonders of LSD, which pissed them off no end.
Yeah, it was a bit strange. It seemed like he was stealing their thunder a bit there, yeah. And then 3 days later, they meet Elvis. Now, what do we know about that?
I read an incident where they were greatly disappointed when Elvis told them that he was about to make a film, and, it's about a boy lost in life, and then comes to... As in the plot to all his movies was hinged on this recycled. And for the guys, this rebel to society that they'd idolized, that he should fall so low, seemed to triple.
He made so many films as well. Something like 30 or 40, yeah. Something ridiculous. Yeah. But according to the accounts of it, he was still quite slim, and he was still in fairly good health, even though he hadn't been doing the rock and roll. He was quite a few years from the sort of Vegas and the jumpsuits and everything. What have we heard? I mean, we've heard that Elvis was playing bass. Paul was apparently had a chat with him about that, and Elvis was watching TV with the sound off, and John Lennon said, that's exactly what I do at home, So,
yeah.
But apparently some accounts say that they did actually say to him, why don't you do rock and roll anymore? And he said, well, it's this film schedule, I can't get out of it or something like that. And he said, I'll do a rock and roll record sometime in the future, I'll do it again. And then the comeback special was 68, so...
One trip or another, we met Elvis. It was one of the highlights of our visit. It was funny because by the time we got near his house, we forgot where we were going. We were in this Cadillac limousine. And you know what it's like in LA, everything goes round and round and round and round, and then I think we're going along Mulholland.
He had a TV going all the time, which is what I do anyway, and in front of the TV he had a massive big bass amplifier, Fender bass amplifier, or just a Fender amplifier. So the bass plugged in it, and he's playing bass all the time with the picture off on the TV. So we just got in there and played with him, you know. We all plugged in what was ever around, and we all played and sang.
I never jammed with Elvis at all.
No. John said he did on the
John
interview.
jammed with Elvis.
Yeah, it must have been
He
when
used to
we
go
went
over
out of the room.
secretly at night.
I think it was because he had a bass there, you know, so I thought...
The basement.
Right, well, you know, bass, hey, he's
Ringo was
interested in
playing
bass.
football with him there.
Yeah, I played football with Elvis.
I don't remember. I spent most of the party trying to suss out from his gang if anybody had any refund.
We were asking him about this, just making movies and, you know, not doing any personal appearances or TV. And he seems to enjoy it. I think he enjoys making movies so much. Because we couldn't stand not doing personal appearances, you know. He says he misses it a bit, you know. He was great, you know. It's just how I expected him.
Years later, didn't Elvis talk to Nixon about the bad influence the Beatles had on there? I mean...
Exactly.
Yeah,
While Elvis was doped up on prescription drugs.
Yeah.
Oh, craziness. Epstein was there and they had like a gambling table set up. So Epi was doing that with Colonel Tom Parker and some of the Memphis Mafia. But I think it's what I was saying to you earlier about the egos didn't quite match, you know. And with Dylan, they kind of did when they met him. But with Elvis, I guess they were never really going to be friends, were they? They were two different worlds, maybe.
Well, Dylan could be as cutting to people he didn't have much time for. He met Peter Grant, and Grant told him, I managed Led Zeppelin. And Dylan said, hey man, I don't come to you with my problems.
Yeah. That's funny. I think with Dylan, because he was a writer as well, they had that in common.
Yes.
But Elvis didn't write his own stuff, so he certainly owned it, though, I must say, you know. Elvis had the ability to really make something his own that he hadn't actually written himself. That was a skill as well, you know.
Yes, the Beatles also did that with whatever they covered. They made it their own type of record.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, Twist and Shout, for example, Money.
Yes.
And then they played the Hollywood Bowl, so that's August 29th and 30th. That was another big deal. Again, we have the audio of that. It's come out multiple times, actually. Doesn't really sound like it probably would have sounded on the night again, but we probably don't want to hear that bad one. We'd rather hear a better version, I think. We're just listening to it for pleasure.
They're probably involved in their mythology where everything has to be perfect.
I mean, it's a product at the end of the day, isn't it? And
you hear stories years later about Led Zeppelin playing really badly at Live Aid, and they personally paid Bob Geldof money to take the footage out of the concert.
Oh, right. Did they spruce it up, or did they just take it out completely?
When the DVDs were re-released in 2004, 2005, the Zeppelin guys, they said they would donate quite a bit of money in charity to exclude the footage because they played horrifically that day. So under-rehearsed.
Yeah.
Page was having his personal problems and, yeah.
All right.
Mm-hmm.
And then we kind of enter the last phase. I haven't really got anything for September. They came back from this tour at the end of August. And then Rubber Soul starts. Now, just got a couple of things to say about this. First of all, the fact that the sessions didn't start till October the 12th, and they had to get an album out for Christmas. The people in the studio said they never seemed to be panicking. They always seemed to think, well, don't worry, we'll come up with something. And they got it. The album actually came out December the 3rd. So you're talking about, God, what's that, less than 2 months later. And they just did it.
Yes.
They just, well, there you go. I've got this one. Oh, I've got this one called Norwegian Word. I've got another one called Nowhere Man. Oh, I've got this nice song called In My Life, you know. Oh, there you go.
And the innovation, I mean, George, do you want to play guitar on Norwegian Wood? No, I'd rather play sitar.
Yeah.
I mean, Paul says I'll play 2 bass lines, one of fuzz on...
Think for Yourself.
Think for Yourself, George's song.
Yourself, yeah.
Ironically, I couldn't think of it.
Yeah, the fuzz bass and the normal bass. Yeah, you're right. Very interesting. Norman Hurricane Smith, who's the engineer, who I think Jeff Emmerich took over from, there was an interesting quote. He said they came back from their American tour to start Rubber Soul, and he said something had changed. He said the family feeling that they'd always had gone. I thought that was a very interesting quote. And he said there was something between John and Paul had changed. Some distance had been created somehow. But it's interesting to see that in 65. That doesn't mean that it's necessarily a downward trajectory, because Revolver, apparently they were quite happy. And
Part of growing up, I suppose. We all go through our ups and ends,
That's it. I mean, a lot of it is just young guys. They're not always going to get on well. And, they're going through this amazing period of just being in their 20s for a start. Yeah. That's a big enough deal in itself, let alone being Beatles. But interestingly, the second day of the Rubber Soul sessions was the first session that went past midnight.
Ooh.
And again, suddenly we're going from, you're going to be recording 1 till 4 and 7 till 10, which was a traditional thing at Abbey Road, to suddenly, we're going to stay here as long as we want,
Yeah, well, I mean, they'd earned it by that point.
Yeah, that's it. They'd made the money and they said, well, we're going to record until we feel like it. And then when you get to Sgt. Pepper and the White Album, and they're recording till sometimes 5, 6 in the morning.
Yes. I think it was 65 when George Martin left one label and set up his own because he was unhappy with the earnings he was receiving, which given that he had produced this gold dust, he deserved the money.
Yeah, I mean, in 63, I think he spent, out of 52 weeks, something like 30. Again, someone listening will fill that in for me, but more than half of the weeks at number one were George Martin records in 63. And I imagine 64 and 65 was something similar.
Mm-hmm.
But I've just written down a few recordings. So 18th In My Life, this is October, 21st, Norwegian Wood, 22nd, Nowhere Man. And they're just, most of these are done in one session. Norwegian Wood was remade. In My Life had this kind of Bach-style overdub that George Martin did. But
yes.
Would you say that this was the best of their albums up to a certain point of fairly straight rock and roll, let's say?
By a long shot, I think. This is the most assured, most sophisticated.
It's a huge favourite of mine.
I didn't know you were into music. Oh, I know you're a DJ, but I've heard your show.
Yeah, I mean, I like all the bands. I've got a broad taste, from the Britpop bands like UB40, Def Leppard, right back to classic rock like Wings.
Who's Wings?
They're only the band the Beatles could have been.
Well, I love the Beatles.
Yeah, so do I.
What's your favourite Beatles album then?
Tough one. I think I'd have to say The Best of the Beatles.
I'm wondering within my life, I mean, I'm one of those who thinks it's a Lennon-McCartney co-write. I can definitely hear a lot of Paul's influence in the music.
Well, the telltale sign is that actually, I mean, they've done kind of, some guitar magazines and some music scholars have done they've studied all their melodies, and John's melodies don't tend to travel very much, and Paul's have these kind of octave leaps and things. And In My Life is quite an expansive melody, which is kind of McCartney's fingerprint, so I'm with you on that. And when I did this Best Songs episode, I didn't choose that one specifically because I felt it was probably a 50-50.
Yeah. Going back to Ian MacDonald, he made a very good study talking about the chord progressions, and his methodological use or forensics analysis is very, very good in this place. Yeah.
What I liked about that Revolution in the Head book was that he wasn't a fan of all the songs, and some famous songs he kind of not trashed, but he really picked hold. Well, not even picked hold, criticised them. Yes. Sometimes the Beatles are a bit beyond criticism, aren't they? But they shouldn't be.
My favourite of those is All Together Now. He says it's trite enough to be sung at football stadiums.
Oh, ouch.
Yeah. I agree with him, though.
And then sometime around the end of October 26th, they received their MBEs at Buckingham Palace. What's the apocryphal story about that?
Wasn't there absolute outrage that, these venerable soldiers who fought for their country, they deserved them, whereas these top pop stars writing how dare you give these men MBEs?
Yeah. Well, I was referring to them possibly smoking a joint in the toilets.
Oh, sorry.
No, I'm only kidding. That's more relevant what you said.
Flippant remarks from young, long-haired and irreverent pop singers only fueled the sense of outrage felt by some previous MBE recipients. A few registered their disgust by returning their precious medals to Buckingham Palace.
Well, I think it's a question of basic standards and the dignity of the order. Basically, an honour should be awarded simply for actions, deeds both in war and peace, above and beyond the call of duty and financial reward. There are many deserving people today who do just that, and they are not rewarded. It appears that if people are very successful in business or in other lines and make a lot of money, they are heaped with rewards. This, in my opinion, is wrong. I have no objection to the Beatles as individuals, but I feel they're being used politically in order to swing the moronic vote.
No, you're right. And then what was John Lennon's response? Well, they got theirs for killing people.
And we got ours for not killing people.
Yeah, for entertaining people. Again, like, it's amazing to think that he didn't get into more trouble for that. But I guess with...
truthful, yeah.
Yeah, but, what's the truth got to do with, mainstream life? Only occasionally coincides. But,
as we said on last year's episode, I mean, people didn't seem to bat an eyelid to the "we're bigger than Jesus" comments in Britain, but in America, furore, mass burnings.
Oh, absolutely. I think the other thing is that in the Lennon Remembers interview, he said that a lot of it was that everybody wanted to keep the party going. Yeah. So if, you called out the Beatles on apparently their orgies on tour and maybe heavier stuff than smoking weed, it's kind of going to bring the party down for everyone. So I think it sort of happened in the latter half of the 60s with Sergeant Pilcher and all that kind of thing.
Was it in Australia in 65 where the boys were at their wildest?
64.
64.
There's a documentary that was online for a while. I don't know if it is still now, called When the Beatles Drove Us Wild. And it's about the most candid about the sexual stuff.
That was with Jimmy Nicol in the band, wasn't it?
Yeah. I think Ringo did go to Australia. I think it's about half and half. Yeah. Okay. And then we get this TV show, which I actually rewatched yesterday, and enjoyed a lot. The Music of Lennon and McCartney. Have you seen that? Or?
Yes, I've written some notes on it.
Oh, go on, go for it.
So, listeners are invited to serenade in the yesterday pop hits that channeled the band's extraordinary trajectory. A tasteful piano splash opens listeners on a sultry, smouldering brass-heavy rendition of I Feel Fine. It's a batty vignette of pastels that finds the Beatles songwriters on a crusade to hear Peter and Gordon's sweet canticles. Paul is earnest, John is flippant, and both are radiant.
Oh, brilliant. I love it. Yeah, that George Martin bit, he actually transitions from Tchaikovsky, dun, 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 to I Feel Fine, yeah. Dun, nice. Dun, 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 as you said, with the horns. Brilliant stuff. And it's, it's only, November 65. I mean, they're not even halfway through their career, and they've got this official recognition.
Yes.
And I think maybe modern listeners have to realize that they were basically considered to be a boy band.
Yes.
I mean, I wouldn't say they were ever the level of New Kids on the Block. It wasn't that low, but something like, I don't know if you remember when Take That emerged. I mean, that was kind of comparable because they had a songwriter, Gary Barlow, but the Beatles really weren't taken seriously. But suddenly, just by November 65, and this is obviously before Rubber Soul came out, and I'm sure Rubber Soul was covered to death, but there's all these people like Ella Fitzgerald and people covering their tunes. The inserts are a bit uncomfortable, but they're fun. I like the one with Cilla Black. And
we couldn't possibly do a show without the wonderful and talented Thingy.
Hey, I'm watching you on the...
She's watching us on the... You're a lovely girl, Cilla. You're a lovely girl.
Yeah.
But, it's just
John's
great.
Having fun. Yeah. John's having fun. They weren't the only ones who sang The World Without Love and stuff like that.
Yeah, and then they go through all the languages, don't they?
Yes.
Because there have been tons of cover versions in many, many languages as well. Do you know the one I love is Henry Mancini when he does If I Fell on the piano?
It's stunning.
Oh, absolutely beautiful.
I think of that Richard Lester quote where he said, if Cliff Richard says, let's do the show right here, he means it. Whereas if John says it, he's taking the piss out of that kind of, let's do the show right here.
Yeah, sometimes it's hard to tell, isn't it?
Yeah.
Like I say, you can get away with it. That was John Lennon's act of subversion. When he wasn't allowed to be openly contemptuous of the establishment, he'd just chuck in little comments. I think that was his way of squaring it with himself almost,
Probably,
Yeah.
It can't have been easy for George Harrison, who's starting to become a budding songwriter, and this is where he's relegated to, the band lead guitarist, because it's the music of Lennon and McCartney, not the music of the Beatles.
Yeah, I mean, George and Ringo, I think they perform a Day Tripper, don't they? And maybe, I guess we can work it out. But George and Ringo are not really part of this other than that, like you said. And George was a few years behind, basically.
I can forgive Philip Norman for some of the Lennon bias in Shout or some of his anti-McCartney tirades, but I find it deeply unforgivable of the eulogy he wrote to George Harrison days after he died. And one of the worst comments, he said that Ringo could accept being a second Beatle, but George never could. And I think to myself, why the hell should George have accepted it if he's as good a guitar player and as wistful a lyricist as he is?
I know, yeah. Listeners, you should try and find that. It's absolutely shocking. It's just
horrible,
catty and bitchy. And they asked him if he was going to do a George Harrison biography, and he's like, "Oh, what's the point? There's nothing there," kind of thing.
He despised it. The opening line is, when I first met George Harrison, he struck me as a miserable git. I never realised how true that would be.
I mean, George did have that grumpy side. I mean, maybe it was just a first impression that maybe he just goes too far on first impressions or something. But yeah, he's a bit checkered, definitely.
If Olivia Harrison, days after losing her husband, had to read that in a newspaper, I mean, it's vicious.
Yeah, I mean, it was just beyond the pale, really. So the rest of November is all about Rubber Soul, basically. The actual last session was November the 11th, 6 p.m. to 7 a.m., 13 hours straight. And considering that only just started recording after midnight about a month earlier, that's pretty revolutionary as well. They recorded Girl, which is one of my favourites. So you love that song.
Wonderful, yeah. He later said the girl in question was Yoko, and that was the idealised woman he wanted to be with, and he eventually found it in Yoko Ono.
That's right. Ian MacDonald in the book Revolution in the Head talks about that sort of fancy woman. I think Dylan and maybe Jagger have written about this woman as well. So that was Rubber Soul wrapped up. So November 23rd, they recorded these videos at Twickenham. So this is We Can Work It Out, Day Tripper, Help, Ticket to Ride, and I Feel Fine. I guess you've seen those, have you?
I have indeed, yes.
Yeah.
Is that the one where John's mucking away at the organ and pulling silly faces when...
Yeah, We Can Work It Out. Yeah, absolutely. That was the harmonium that was played by Ina Sharples in the original Coronation Street programs.
Oh, God.
That's not going to change your life, that information, listeners.
They're looking very, very well in those dark lapels. Like, I always felt they looked a little uncomfortable in those, those shirt and ties. But once they discarded the ties and the businessman-like, and they're just looking a lot more European in their dress, they look
because black polo necks I always think work quite well. They always look quite French or arty or something about it. They did do some videos in the Shea Stadium outfits as well, actually. They did a mixture. There's a couple of famous videos. There's the I Feel Fine one where they're just eating fish and chips. An outtake. But then there's a brilliant video where Ringo, instead of playing the drums, there's an exercise bike set up. Remember?
Yes, that's pretty surreal and out there.
Yeah, it's pretty funny. And then Ticket to Ride, again, listeners, if you want to watch this, John's mouthing the words completely differently from the melody. And if you look in the background, Ringo's doing this weird thing where he's pretending to play the drums.
Yeah.
Quite amusing.
It must have been boring for the musicians miming away to their hard craft.
Yeah, but they made it fun for themselves, didn't they? And in 65, the marijuana thing helped them with that, I think. I mean, they said they were rolled out the taxi when they met Elvis, and they were sort of giggling away. Must have been taking the edge off it for them. And then the Help video. Have you seen the Help video where they're sitting with John at the front, then Paul, then George, then Ringo? They're actually sitting in single file, so to speak. And I thought that was really good because that's really the Beatles, the early Beatles dynamic perfectly there. John at the front, Paul and George are kind of going to the left and the right, trying to get their heads into the shot.
Yes. Mark Lewison called it the chain that John brought Paul into the band, Paul brought George into the band, and George fought for Ringo to be in the band.
Absolutely. It's just perfect, isn't it? Yeah. So then we get Rubber Soul, and on the same day, December the 3rd, we get Day Tripper and We Can Work It Out. So, I mean, not only the Rubber Soul album, but 2 classic singles as a double A side. I think they'd really mastered pure pop by the end of 65. I think that's something that a lot of people would agree on. And then just the last thing, they did the last British tour, December the 3rd to the 12th. And on December the 5th, they played their last concert in Liverpool at the Empire.
Really?
End of an era.
It was an end of an era.
I mean, they did want to go back to the Cavern, actually. When 66, when they toured in Germany, they wanted to go back to Hamburg and possibly play in the Star Club. And they said, forget it. Too much chaos, too many fans. And same with the Cavern as well. They wanted to play there at a later date, but just wasn't feasible.
Of course, the last time George Harrison played in Liverpool was when he toured with Eric Clapton and Bonnie and Delaney, those guys who went on to become
69.
Derek and the Dominos. Yeah.
That's right, yeah. And they were just he was an anonymous guy at the back, wasn't he?
I love these stories about George Harrison, that he's hanging out with the Pythons in New York, and he says, could I sing, I'm a Lumberjack? And they say, yeah, go on. So he joins the Mounties. And nobody knows George Harrison is on stage singing along to I'm a Lumberjack.
Oh, it must be lovely, though, to fade in the background, though, when you've been at the front all that time. Yes. Okay, so we're going to finish this by talking about the John Lennon songs from the second half of the year. So mostly it's Rubber Soul.
So we have Day Tripper, We Can Work It Out, Norwegian Wood, Nowhere Man, The Word, Michelle, What Goes On, Girl, In My Life, Wait, Run for Your Life. That's a very, very commendable collection of songs, and that's only 6 months' work. It's not 12 months' work.
Yeah, well, it's not bad, is it? They may not have even started writing these till September, October even.
Of course.
Amazing. I mean, We Can Work It Out was obviously he did the bridge, and Michelle, he did the bridge, but all those other ones are predominantly his. I mean, what a list.
Paul had a bit of a hand with Day Tripper as well.
That's right. To be honest, I think there are certain albums where we know that they were having regular writing sessions, and Rubber Soul's one of them. Pepper as well. I mean, Hunter Davis witnessed a few of those. Revolver, I'm not so sure about, but
I think Revolver's where the demarcation of this is a John song and that's a Paul song starts to become more apparent.
Yeah, so I feel like probably most of these songs, I think Nowhere Man, John said he was sitting at home and he was getting absolutely nothing, so then he gave up and then it all came to him. The Word they definitely wrote together.
Yes.
Where they'd written the lyrics, they decorated it with an artistic picture, colourful picture. Yes. But what would be your favourites there if you had to pick one or two?
The Word, I think it's a sophisticated piece of music. I mean, I love Paul's piano, George's, lead guitar breaks. I think Mal Evans is on that track, isn't he, playing Hammond?
I think George Martin did harmonium, but I could be wrong.
Maybe. Okay.
Well, they're great lyrics in the good and the bad books that I've read. In the beginning, I misunderstood, but now I've got it. The Word is good.
I think it's a bit unfair when you see on YouTube comments when Paul McCartney plays it in his concerts, people say, you can't sing that, it's a John song. Why should Paul follow what a YouTube commenter thinks he should or should not play?
Yeah, or what he wrote, yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, Paul, you didn't write that. Oh, no, I did. I have to say, though, Paul does all these interviews and he tells all these stories and the interviewers sort of tee them up as if they're new stories. Oh, how did you write Helter Skelter? Did you really dream yesterday and all that? And everybody's like, oh. Yeah. One of the things is that he said that him and John wrote 300 songs. And I mean, there aren't even 300 Beatles songs.
That might be a bit of an exaggeration, yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure why he has to say stuff like that. But anyway.
There was the stories he came out with where he and John shared a wank together.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I think all the guys, Pete Shotton and all those guys were involved in that as well.
Oh, God. Yeah.
Oh, they'd all say the names of let's say shout out Marilyn Monroe, Bridget Bardot, and then John would shout out Winston Churchill. Put them off. That's the old Lennon humour.
Yeah. You mentioned Girl, I think that's musically one of John's most interesting, like with the Greek chords, like da 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 da. Yeah. Well, that might be George Harrison. Either way, it's a wonderful illustration of desire, I suppose. You've got, I would say, Norwegian Wood is a good song. It also has, isn't it the first time a sitar was used on a European record?
Absolutely, yeah.
He was also the principal writer of What Goes On, which is a song which I think is one of the better songs Ringo sang. So I think that's a good one in that country.
And Ringo got a co-credit, and they said, how much did you write on What Goes On? Have you written anything? And he goes, I wrote about 4 words to What Goes On. I haven't done a thing since. It's a great answer. With Girl, they made it sound like, I think it's not a balalaika. Shit, I always get this wrong. Bouzouki, which is a Greek instrument. But it was actually done with 12-string and 6-string acoustic guitars, John and George.
Okay.
Yeah, and when I was researching this, when I did this Best Songs podcast with Jason Barnard, apparently they said in that it was John's answer to Michelle, in that Paul had a Euro song and John had a Euro song, because it's like a German two-step with Zorba the Greek kind of sound on it.
Yeah.
Amazing stuff.
Actually, going back to Nowhere Man, it's a good song, but it's a wonderful recording. How it starts off with a wall of voices and then the instruments come in. And Paul's on fire. I mean, at the very end of the song, he just hits this impossibly high falsetto note that brings it to another level. And that's up there with like the greatest of the Beatles recordings. And like George's twangy guitar just comes in and out. And the ooh la 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 harmonies are marvelous. And
oh, yeah, no argument. And Paul's bass playing has started to become special as well. I mean, the Word, he started doing these flourishes and it's just crazy.
Yeah. 4 years later, we get to She's So Heavy and
yeah, ding, 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 and all that. I'm not going to seek to defend Run For Your Life. I actually quite like it, but Jason Barnard already told me everything that's wrong with it.
Yeah, he made a very compelling argument as to why it was the track it is and why it's wrong.
Okay, I'll direct listeners back to that episode something. 34? Yeah, episode 34, listeners. Go back to that. I don't think it's too bad. I think it kind of sticks out on Rubber Soul because it seems to belong to a slightly earlier era. And it's also the end song as well. I think the beginning song and the end song are quite important in that they're going to stand out. I mean, if you stuck it in the middle there along with maybe Wait or something like that, which again, I don't think is a bad song, but Wait was originally recorded for Help. So if you'd stuck Run for Your Life in the middle there, maybe it wouldn't have stood out so much.
I think In My Life should have closed the album on this reflective note about, they're at this point of their career and they're looking back on it and celebrating.
Sure.
And
If I Needed Someone would have been a good finish as well.
I agree. Yeah.
Yeah.
That was probably the best song George had yet written for the band.
Yeah. All right, so that's 1965. What can we say to round this off?
I mean, it was a big step forward, especially for John Lennon's writing. I mean, that's 2 killer albums. If you'd taken the 5 or 6 songs he wrote for Help and the 5 or 6 songs he wrote for Rubber Soul, that might be the best solo album of his career.
Yeah. Well, the guys did that. Richard Buskin and the other guys did that for 68. They did a John's White Album and a Paul's White Album.
Yes.
And it's very good.
It is telling, yeah.
Yeah, because John's White Album, they added Revolution, the fast one, and then Paul's one was obviously the White Album songs, and they added Hey Jude. So.
Yeah.
I mean, they're all momentous years. It's just amazing.
Incredible. Not only in the Beatles, I think pop music is undergoing a revolution, a renaissance.
Yeah.
Roger Waters once said that Sgt. Pepper's was their permission to go forward, as a permission for artists to go forward. I'd say they were given permission in 65, considering the caliber of work.
Yeah. Like I say, I mean, these singles, I'm drawn to these singles still, more than the albums, in fact, because some of them they're just perfection. You can't get any better. There's songs that have equaled them, but there's just perfect pop music. So many. I mean, we haven't mentioned stuff like the Byrds also had Turn, Turn, Turn as well.
I mean, you hear that Keith Richards wasn't entirely happy with Satisfaction because he wanted a brass section. I'm like, you can't touch that. It's perfect the way it is.
Yeah, well, he got a fuzz pedal because they were intending to add brass, and that was supposed to be a fill-in thing. And they said, "Oh, why don't you just keep that? Sounds good."
It's generally considered the Stones' best single.
Yeah. Oh, it stood the test of time, no doubt. All right. I'll put links and everything, but tell us again who you're writing for at the moment and what have you got coming up?
Okay, well, I'm a different band, but I'm actually finishing a book that I'm currently writing on U2. So I'm heavily inspired by Revolution in the Head of trying to write an album guide. So that'll be published. I'm sending that to Sonic Bond. The deadline's coming up, so I need to get cracking. So back to it.
Wow, get yourself a bottle of whiskey and finish that off.
Yeah. But you can read the Pete Best interview at Far Out, Alan-Parsons interview at We Are Cult, and I've interviewed a couple of other people like Eric Stewart and Danny Lane for Culture Sonar.
All right, awesome. Well, this will be going out in July, like I said, but I'll put all the links on there and everyone will know where to get your stuff. And thanks very much for coming on the program again.
Thank you very much for having me.
And we'll get you on, if we go back 1 year again. Oh, I've done 64 now. We'll have to do 63.
Okay, fair enough. Why not?
Or whatever you want. 68, 67.
Whatever you want. Whatever you need.
Yeah, let's talk about Status Quo instead.
I'd rather not.
They're the band the Beatles could have been.
You can hear some of Status Quo on the Ram album with Smile Away. Talk about Paul.
Oh, yeah? Ah. All right. Okay, mate. Stay on the line for a sec and I'll just say goodbye now. So, all the best and talk to you in the future.
Indeed. Talk to you now.
All right. Take care.
You too.
Bye. So there you have it. That was episode 48. And that was 1965. Hope you enjoyed that. And the usual diverse array of clips there. Very nice to have Alan Partridge on my podcast. For American and overseas listeners who may not have heard, that was a guy who was saying the best of the Beatles. That's a famous comic creation by Steve Coogan. Although Steve Coogan is known in America, so I'm sure you've heard of him. In fact, just reflecting on that about Rubber Soul there, quite amazing that they actually recorded it from October the 12th to November the 11th, so basically a month. And, they're under great pressure. As I mentioned earlier, Norman Smith had said that there was some turmoil going on within the band. And I think George was really struggling with Paul, trying to tell him what to do and sometimes playing the guitar parts himself. But I think another thing we've talked about, they were able to switch from one mode to another so they could enjoy the music at the same time. And I mean, I'm more and more convinced now that what Paul said in many years from now is probably right. They were having regular writing sessions so that this was quite a bit of a co-written album, because I think having that pressure, they would have just said, right, John and Paul, every day, 3 hours or most days, we're going to churn these out. And I'm not sure if it's in Revolution in the Head, the book that Owen was referencing, Ian MacDonald. I think he said that these were the songs that made their reputation. And certainly up to that point they did. And that TV special that we just talked about, the music of Lennon and McCartney, I mean, that just absolutely cements it. And that's just a fraction, really. As I said, they weren't even halfway through, Another interesting thing about Rubber Soul is that being a guitarist as I am, I have an affection for that album because you could just sit down and play the songs. So as much as I do like Revolver, if you think about it on Revolver, there's very few that you could sit down with an acoustic guitar and just play them. And that's not to say that they necessarily needed lots of augmentation, let's say, but there's something satisfying when you can just do that, when you can just play the song and you don't need any effects or anything. And you could argue, the Pepper songs don't really lend themselves to acoustic guitar either. White Album, some do, some don't. So I think Rubber Soul, as we said, was definitely a huge peak up to that point. And I would argue, because there's so many Beatles, as we've said before, it's very hard to pick one, but that phase was well served by Rubber Soul, and I think it's an absolute classic. So on to the next show, or the next two shows, because this will be another two-parter, and a bit of a monster as well. I haven't started work on editing yet, but I just know it's going to be. And it'll be clips galore, probably a bit like today. And the topic is going to be drugs. We talked about weed quite a bit from 1965. And my guest is Tom Hunyadi from a couple of podcasts, Talk More Talk, and also his Paul McCartney podcast, Two Legs. We recorded this a while ago, and Tom and I reviewed the book Riding So High, The Beatles and Drugs. It's going to be more or less Beatles discussion, but John Lennon tends to dominate the drug discussion, so it'll probably kind of fall that way anyway. That's going to be the next one, hopefully next week, but we'll see how that goes. We recorded a lot of material for that, so I'll get cracking on putting that together. And just finally, just to say, the show is picking up all the time. I'm trying to get the YouTube channel a bit more active, so if you do have a minute to subscribe to the YouTube channel, to iTunes as well, and then rate and possibly review on iTunes or Stitcher. It's a great help. So, I hope you enjoyed that, and I'll see you very soon. All the best, and goodbye. Right, let's get on to
I'm on a podcast. I'm on a podcast. Can we talk later? Yeah, I'm on a podcast. Bye, Mum. Every year, Anthony.
Yeah, it happened last year, didn't it? Someone rang you.
Mother's, eh?
Yeah.